Last week, I spoke briefly about storytelling, and I talked about how storytelling is a method for turning information into knowledge, for getting people to engage with organized data in order to create meaning from it. And hearing stories is a way to take information that's kind of abstract, like whether a school has a lot of free and reduced lunch eligible kids, and making it relatable and meaningful, like figuring out if that's a good thing or a bad thing and what the solution might be if one is needed. This week, we're going to dive a little deeper into storytelling. What's really cool about storytelling with digital media, as opposed to traditional storytelling like printed books, is that the audience can participate. So earlier we looked at sort of how linear printed materials are and have traditionally been. We talked about organization of those materials. So I gave the example of a library and how if you have printed materials in the library, the way you organize them is kind of how you're stuck unless you completely reorganize the whole thing. And the beauty about the web is that we can associate things in different ways and we can associate them differently all at the same time. So with the web, you don't have the same limitations, and we see that in storytelling as well. Instead of just reading a story or hearing a story, audiences can actually have an effect on the stories or even participate in them. So stories become something that is no longer linear. You don't have to start at the beginning of the book and read all the way to the end. Just like you can change the organization of web pages, you can jump around the sort of pages or scenes of a story using digital media. One aspect of Shedraff's model that I glossed over last week is this important bubble right here. Experience. Our knowledge is often affected by our experience. There's an old proverb that is usually attributed to Benjamin Franklin, although there's not really any evidence that I'm aware of he ever said this, that goes something like this: tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I learn. And people learn by doing, and you see that a lot at Ball State. That's why we have what used to be called immersive learning as a concept is now called entrepreneurial learning. The whole point of both of those things is just that students learn better by doing, and so the push is for students to be actively involved in making things. Stewart talks about this week in his TED Talk. He talks about transmedia narratives, which are narratives that rely on the audience or reader to do something, and narratives that are not necessarily linear, that drop parts of the story or elements of characters, plot points, things like that into different media that the audience or reader can interact with and participate in. McGonagall writes about the same thing when she writes about I Love Bees, a very famous and well-documented transmedia experience. In her piece, she explains how she made a story that was interactive, that required readers to actually do something to make the story progress, and why that helped people to engage with the material. But her case study is also fascinating because she writes in the first paragraph about data and ideas and the network we talked about last week. She's explaining here that the story she made, I Love Bees, created a reason for people to get together and share data, information, and ideas in order to analyze it and build knowledge together. So this goes back to Bush's ideas on as we may think. He's talking about thinking together, and this is what McGonagall is talking about as well. And here's what she wrote on this concept, which is called collective intelligence. And here's Shedraff's model. So the game that she made, the story, I Love Bees, got people to work together to go through this model. And she shows how people work together to bring their data and information together in these online forums to build knowledge in a way that no one player could have done on their own. You also see examples of this participatory or experiential storytelling in the classroom when you learn by simulation. A couple of years ago at Ball State, there was a poverty simulation group that the College of Communication, Information, and Media, I believe, brought to campus that put on a role-playing game in which students played the part of Americans living in poverty. And I participated in that role-playing exercise, and I got a card about my character. I was paired with 3 students who were my family members. They had their own characters that were related to mine. My character was that of an elderly grandma who was raising 2 grandkids, and I had a spouse who was on disability. I made a certain amount of money at a part-time job that I had, and I made a certain amount in Social Security payments because I was a grandma, and I had a list of bills related to running my household, like electricity and gas, and getting my grandkids to school. Every hour was a day, I believe, and at the beginning of every hour, I got a list of bills that were due that day and, things my kids had to be at, things I had to do. So I had to run the household and manage our money. And I actually ended up getting evicted from my imaginary house because I did not do a very good job. And you see the same kinds of simulations in digital media too, that are meant to put people in someone else's shoes and get them to experience something based on data and information in a way that they probably have not experienced it. A good example is the online game Spent, in which the reader takes on the role of the main character and makes decisions based on real-life events and situations. And you can go to playspent.org and click around in this just for a couple minutes to kind of see how it works. Or you can click on the screenshot in the PowerPoint of this lecture in order to be taken to playspent.org. So I'm just going to walk through very briefly the first couple steps of this story. So as you can see, what's happening is I'm being faced with real scenarios that actually happen to people, and I'm having to make a decision. So this is a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, but the decisions that I make influence what happens. So it is a story based on the decisions I'm making that is allowing me to experience living in poverty in a way that I can't do in my regular sort of everyday life. And since we're on the topic of stories, I want to explain the purpose of the Jenkins reading here. Because McGonagall's I Love Bees story serves as an example of how people can participate in stories rather than just consume them. The playspent.org serves as an example of how people can participate in stories rather than just consume them. And the benefit of that is that it allows players to experience something which again aids in knowledge building going off of Shedroff's model. Jenkins' piece about narrative architecture presents 4 different structures for creating narratives that are participatory. And this is something that you'll come back to in ICOM 375, digital storytelling. The 4 structures for participatory structures, as Jenkins classifies them, are evocative spaces, which work with an existing story or draw heavily upon a genre. So Star Wars uses a lot of evocative spaces. There's lots of Star Wars games and comic books and graphic novels and regular novels, and they all sort of touch on this Star Wars franchise and the main narratives and world of Star Wars. So as you work through those stories, they're sort of drawing on an existing story. Enacting stories is a structure in which players perform or witness narrative events. Embedded narratives are when the plot points are revealed by players or revealed to players by actions that they take. This is almost like a scavenger hunt where instead of finding an object, you find some part of the story that's important. It could be an object from the story, but it could be a plot point or a character. Emergent narratives are sandbox worlds, so stories that aren't really full stories. The players get props and environments that belong to a story world, and they kind of create the story within them. So World of Warcraft allows for a lot of emergent narratives. If you like to go on raids in that game, you can sort of build a story all about raids. If you like to farm gold, you can do that. So the players sort of get props, environments, and characters, and they create the stories that are interesting to them from those elements of the story world. And the type of structure that you choose depends on the goals of your story and what kind of knowledge you want people to gain. The spent story is about getting readers to experience something that is actually happening. So it's important that it uses factual scenarios and information based on real data. It's an enacted story. An emergent story would be a poor choice here because if the reader can do almost anything they want in the story world, he or she might entirely miss out on role-playing as someone living in poverty. And the goal of the spent simulation story is to get people to experience virtually what it's like to live in poverty. So if you have an emergent narrative and you've created a world where people can not do that, then you're not achieving the goal of the story. So you're reading about these 4 structures for narratives because the type of narrative structure you use changes what the story is capable of doing.